Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to episode number 5 in our video series about Java JDBC full CRUD application. In the previous video, we were able to implement the create operation for our rentals entity. At this point, we are pretty much done with the create functionality for all our data entities. But before we move on to the other operations, let us first implement some validation on our models so that we will be able to filter out invalid data and therefore preventing any crashes on our application, as well as preventing some invalid data from crossing over to our database, and also to keep our database integrity intact. So this video, that's what we are going to do. Let's get on with it. So first, let's add the validation function into our car class. So first, let's decide I think we should do customer first, because customer is a bit simpler, since all the customer's data are all strings, and we decide what kind of validation rules shall we apply for all these properties on our customer. And I think the only validation we can apply here is the required rule, such that you should make all these values have a content. Otherwise, if any one of these properties will have an empty string, or null for that matter, it's going to be an invalid set of data. Okay, so that's the only rule that we're going to apply for the customer model. And to do that, we simply add below a new method called public, and this will return a Boolean that says true or false. Of course, if it is valid, then it will return true, and if it's not valid, it will return false. So this should return a Boolean value, and we call this validate. And we also need to pass in here a string buffer where we can put our error messages like that. So here we are going to define first our Boolean value is valid, which will assume as true at the beginning unless or until any of our rules will not be attained, or in that case the invalid is valid becomes false. First, we are going to apply the rule for our last name, which should not be blank. So we're going to say if last or L name dot is blank. If that's the case, we're going to say errors that append the last name should not be empty. And for purposes of having other messages stacked in one line by line, so we're going to assume there's going to be another message that's going to follow this message. So we have to add a line break. And of course, if this is happening, then the whole validation process should be, the is valid, I should say, should be false. But we'll move on to other validations so that the user can see all the errors that occurred in that particular session all at once. So we continue on, the same thing, and since this is the same, we'll just copy this code. And instead here, we're going to say fname, and this is first name. Next, we'll have phone, and this is the phone number. Next is, of course, the address. Is there anything else? License number. And of course, at the end, we are going to return whether it was valid or not. So if none of these if statements will be true, then the is valid would have been true, and so it will return true here. But if any one of the if statements here would be true, then the is valid would be false all the way down, and then that's when we return whether it's valid or not. Okay, so now let's apply this into our cars form, or not customers form, sorry. And on when we save, this should be where we are going to apply the validation on this customer object before we call on the add. So since our validation is a Boolean, returns a Boolean value, we can put this into an if-else statement, such that if the validate is true, then we are going to execute this block of code. Okay? So here we say if c.validate, and of course we're going to pass in a string buffer, which we have to declare it beforehand. Like so. That's when we put our code for the creation or the insertion. We call in our customer DAO and add the data from the C customer object. Otherwise, we are going to have an error message. And the message is, of course, coming from our errors. And since errors is a string buffer, you can just convert that to string like that. Okay, let's try out our validation for the customers. Let's run this program and try opening up customers and try to click on save without typing anything. All right, so here are the error messages that was generated by our validation method. Since all of them are blank, so all of the if statements were triggered. Now if we put something on the last name, now the error message regarding the last name is gone, but the others still exist. And if we do this, for example, we still have one, the license number, or if we have no phone, then the phone will also be there. Okay, so that's our validation for the customer's form. Now let's proceed with adding validation to the cars entity as well. So we have here our cars, car class, and the data that we have in our car. We also have a bunch of strings, but we have an int here. Okay, we'll just make sure that our int follows the format of a year. So maybe we are going to check if the year, it should not be lesser than maybe 1800, because I don't think we have any car that can be rented that was made that was a model on the 17th century. So, for example, that would be one valid rule that we can apply for the year. Okay, but besides that, the make, model, color, and plate, we can just apply the required rule for this. Okay, so again, we add in here a new method called public Boolean validate. And we pass in a string buffer for the errors. Again, we define a Boolean value is valid, which will start off as true. And now we apply some rules. If make that is blank, then errors that append the make field should not be blank. and is valid equals false. So again, we do the same thing for the other string, and this will be model. Then what's next is this should be color. Maybe we can also have another validation rule for color such that only known colors will be written, and that will have a list of possible colors, and if that string is not in the list of colors, then that should be an error. But for simplicity purposes, let's just make it required. Let's just apply the required rule for the color. The other one is plate. And finally, for our year, is simply going to be the least year we can accept. Maybe is 1900. I don't know, but about 1950. Okay, so let's just do it 1950. If year is less than 1950, or year should not be greater than what year we are now. So since we're going to compare this to the current year, let us have a variable for our current year here. Of course, we can do that by having a calendar object. Okay, and the current year is going to be simply cal.get. And we compare that if the year is greater than current year also, then we'll have an error. The year value is invalid. Or let's just say the year value should be between 1950 and the current year. And of course, there's no more error that is going to follow, so we don't have to put the line break there. And finally, of course, we return the is valid. Here, I also forgot that the is valid here should also be false. Like that. Okay, and so let's implement that into our cars form. And here, under save, we actually going to have a possible error here, because it's possible that the user is going to enter a value in the year text field which cannot be converted into an integer, and that at that point this is going to throw in a number format exception. So we can also trap that in here. What we can do is we can put this inside of the try catch. So like that, and aside from the exception that will be caught here, we'll also are going to catch firstly a number format exception. And if this happens, it only means that the year field, the user entered an invalid text on the year field such that it cannot be converted into an integer. So you can also have here another error message for this, and the message you can put would be a non-generic one. That would be the year, or you entered an invalid year. All right. So this will be taken care of, but we also have to add here another, should be C. We still need to create our string buffer. This will be for our errors. And so call C dot validate, and we have our string buffer. All right, and should be an if statement. So if, and put it in here like so. And then else, if there's an error, meaning if the validation is false, then we can again put an error message here, and the message is going to be coming from our errors. So just say errors dot to string, just like that. And let's test out our car validation. Okay, click on cars, and if you click on save, you entered an invalid year. So this will be a first level thing. Let's put here 1999 and click on there, and make field should not be blank. And I think the problem here is we did not put a line break on our messages. So let's go back onto our car Java, and in the validation we should be putting here some line breaks. All right, let's try again. Cars. 2200 should be an invalid year. See, the year value should be between 1950 and 20. And all the other error messages are also there. Field, make field, model, color, and plate. And now we'll try to put in valid data. And save the year. Oh, should be using the year, say 2019. Click on save. There you go, a new car has been added. Right, and finally we also implement the validation for the rentals. So we move on to our rentals object or class. Well, with the rental class, it's going to be a little bit complicated compared to the other two because of the presence of dates for date taken and date returned. We have to check whether the date taken is actually a valid date, which means it should not be from 1800s or something else. And also the date returned should not be earlier than the date taken. And both date taken and date returned should not be farther in the future. So those are the kinds of rules that we need to apply for our date taken and date returned as well. For the deposit, we make sure that the value is not negative nor zero. As for the customer and car, we'll just make sure that they are not null. So let's go on and create that method. So you have public Boolean validate we'll have here Boolean is valid equal to true. First, let's check our customer if it's equal to null, because if it is, we'll append an error. All right, let's just copy this for the car. Now for the date taken, for purposes of dates validation, we need to use local date so that it's easier for us to compute whether it's before or after, and also some other functionalities that is very good in local date. So first, let's have a local date for our taken. Date taken should be converted to local date, and we need to import local date. All right, also have return would be date return to local date. We need to also get the current date as now, and simply local date dot now, and we'll just have a threshold of when a date taken would be valid, and let's just use 1 year. So we'll also have local date earliest. That would be, oops. Should that be of? Yeah. So the year for here would be now, that get year minus 1. Then for the month, it will just be simply now, that get month. And now that get day of month. All right, so now we can try and filter out some validation rules to our date taken and date return. So if date taken that is before, oh no, not that taken, just taken, that is before earliest, or taken that is after now, then we'll have an error. Let's just copy this for the next one. This will be the return should not be before the taken and should not be after now. So the value for date returned is invalid. Finally, we'll have for deposit, if deposit is less than or equal to 0, then errors. Then at the end, of course, we are going to return is valid. All right? So let's implement this into our rentals form right here when we click on save. And here we also have a lot of other issues because this date, that value of, is going to throw an exception if we entered an invalid format of date here for both of this. And also the parse float is going to also throw in a number format exception. So what we can do is we transfer this inside of the try catch right here. And let's go ahead and add some catch clauses here. Let's first catch the number format exception. And if there is an exception in the number format, it's going to be the amount. It's probably because of the amount. So we'll copy this line of code and add here the message would be the value for amount. Is it amount deposited? Amount deposited, yes. The value for, where's that? Okay, also we add another catch clause. And this time we're going to try and to catch the exception that's going to be thrown because of entering invalid text that will be converted into a date, and that would be illegal argument exception. And if that happens, the message is going to be one of the date entries are invalid. One or more of the date. Okay? And of course, the execution of the actual insertion of the data through the rental DAO has to happen only if the validate method is true. So let's, push this there, and instead of here we have if r that validate. We also have to create our string buffer still for errors. And here if r that validate errors, and we can do that. Otherwise, we're going to have another error here, and that's simply the message will be coming from the errors, the string. All right, so let's try this out. Click on rentals and click on save. Of course, it's going to be the amount deposited. Oh no, the date. One or more of the date entries are invalid because an empty string cannot be converted into a date object. Let's try putting in invalidates, although we will be putting, for example, a date such as 1820. That is a valid date. 1225, for example, that is a valid date. Or this can be converted into a date. Also, you can have 2020, 1225. This can also be converted into a date. But these dates should be invalid. You can save the amount. Let's have a valid amount. So you have the customer should not be empty, the car should not be empty, and the value of the date taken is invalid. Actually, we should have another error for the date return, because the date return is invalid because this is after now, right? Let's check back on that. In our rentals, date return should be before taken, or is taken is after now. This should be returned, but I think this should have been triggered here. This should have been true when the taken or the returned is before the taken. Let's try this again. So, for example, should have taken it on November 20. And if it was returned on November 18, this should have been invalid, right? And the value of date returned now is invalid. It should be after. So 21, for example, and the new rental record added. All right, so that's it for this video. We were able to add in validation functions to customers, cars, and rentals. For the next video, we will be implementing some retrieve operations on our entities. So see you then for that next video. And if you like these kinds of video, if you want to see more of these kinds of videos, please subscribe to my channel, hit that like button, and tick that notification bell. And so that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and see you again in the next one.